Good day. Today's lecture is devoted to modern teaching methods as a means of developing teaching effectiveness. In contemporary higher education, effectiveness can no longer be measured solely by the quantity of transmitted information. Rather, it must be assessed in relation to the quality of student engagement, the degree of intellectual independence, and the formation of professional competence. Therefore, the study of modern methods is not an optional methodological interest. On the contrary, it is directly connected with the central tasks of university teaching. At the outset, the lecture defines its primary goal with considerable precision: to evaluate and implement active and interactive teaching methods that foster critical thinking, independent research, and professional competence. In addition, several objectives are specified. These include the study of the classification of teaching methods, the analysis of the transition from passive to active learning, the understanding of interactive dialogue, and the exploration of project-based and modeling techniques. Accordingly, the lecture moves from conceptual clarification to methodological application. In this regard, its structure is pedagogically sound, since it connects theory, classification, and practice within one coherent framework. This slide situates pedagogy within the wider demands of modern development. Economic and social conditions now require specialists who are not merely professionally informed, but also innovative, independent, and adaptable. In other words, contemporary education must prepare graduates who can think critically, search creatively, and construct knowledge under changing circumstances. Consequently, the university cannot remain satisfied with methods that produce only reproductive learning. Rather, it must cultivate those forms of academic work that prepare students for complexity, initiative, and responsible professional action. The central idea of this slide is the shift from the traditional formula teacher-student to the modern formula student-learning. This change is highly significant. In the traditional system, the main emphasis falls on the transfer of information and the reproduction of ready-made knowledge. By contrast, the modern system gives priority to cognitive activity and student independence. Therefore, teaching effectiveness is redefined. It is no longer based simply on successful explanation. Rather, it depends on whether students become intellectually active, self-directed, and capable of meaningful learning. Thus, the paradigm shift concerns not only classroom technique, but the very logic of university instruction. The slide then presents a three-part classification of methods: passive, active, and interactive. In the passive model, communication is linear, the teacher is the source, while the student is the recipient. In the active model, the learner becomes a more equal participant in educational work. In the interactive model, the situation becomes even more complex, since dialogue unfolds not only between teacher and student, but also among students, and in many cases with technology itself. Thus, the classification reflects increasing levels of student participation, cognitive responsibility, and dialogical structure. In this respect, it provides a useful framework for understanding the evolution of teaching practice. Passive methods are described here as the traditional narrative way of conveying content. Their features include direct information transfer, the dominance of the teacher, and the possibility of covering a large amount of material in a relatively short time. These characteristics explain why passive methods have long occupied a stable place in higher education. At the same time, their limitations are clearly indicated. They are less effective where the educational aim is the development of critical skills, creativity, and independence. Accordingly, passive methods may still serve a function. However, they are insufficient when used alone in modern university contexts. By contrast, active teaching methods stimulate cognitive motivation and require students to search for truth independently, solve problematic situations, and follow the logic of their own findings. This is a decisive methodological shift. Knowledge is no longer simply received. Instead, it is acquired through effort, inquiry, and analysis. Therefore, the educational value of active methods lies in their ability to transform the students from a passive listener into a working subject of cognition. In this sense, activity is not an external addition to learning. Rather, it is one of the essential conditions of meaningful understanding. The interactive approach is defined through the very meaning of the word itself, inter as mutual and act as action. Consequently, interactive teaching is based on mutual action and dialogue. The slide identifies three particularly important features: dialogue, multi-source interaction, and comfort. Dialogue ensures learning through exchange of ideas. Multi-source interaction expands communication to include teacher, peers, and digital resources. Comfort, finally, creates a safe and collaborative environment in which students are more willing to take intellectual risks. Thus, interactivity is valuable not only because it increases participation, but because it changes the emotional and communicative conditions of learning itself. Role-playing games are presented here as a particularly effective form of active and interactive teaching. Their pedagogical value lies in three main aspects. First, they simulate professional and innovative activity. Second, they help overcome psychological inertia, that is, the tendency to think within rigid and habitual limits. Third, they require integrated skills, since students must draw on knowledge from several disciplines simultaneously. Accordingly, role-playing games are more than entertaining exercises. They are structured pedagogical tools through which students learn to act, decide, and respond under modeled professional conditions. The project method is described as a pedagogical technology aimed at developing critical thinking and knowledge construction. It is especially important that the slide emphasizes the pragmatic result. In other words, project work does not end with discussion alone. It requires the production of a tangible and meaningful outcome. Moreover, the project method develops inquiry, search skills, socialization in the information space, and personal responsibility for learning. Therefore, project work is significant not merely because students are active, but because they are active in relation to a concrete, purposeful result. The case method is presented through a three-stage logic: identify, model, and resolve. First, students must recognize the core problematic situation. Second, they construct a theoretical or digital model of the problem. Third, they apply analytical tools in order to determine the most appropriate solution. This sequence is methodologically important because it disciplines thought. Instead of reacting immediately and superficially, students are required to pass through diagnosis, representation, and analysis before arriving at judgment. Consequently, the case method strengthens professional reasoning in a particularly direct way. The round table is presented as a collective interaction method in which the teacher formulates the problem, while students generate solutions through joint intellectual activity. This distinction is pedagogically significant. The teacher does not withdraw from the process, however. The teacher's role changes from sole speaker to organizer of collective thought. The slide also emphasizes several important conditions: visual connection among participants, a creative atmosphere, and active inclusion of every voice. Therefore, the roundtable serves not simply as a seating arrangement, but as a pedagogical form that supports collaborative reasoning and shared responsibility for ideas. The final thematic slide before the conclusion refers to two methods in particular: brainstorming and the puzzle method. Brainstorming encourages the rapid generation of ideas without immediate criticism, which is especially useful at the stage of opening up possible directions of thought. The puzzle method, by contrast, is based on collaborative learning, in which each student possesses only one part of the overall solution. Taken together, these methods illustrate an important pedagogical principle. Creativity and structure are not opposites. On the contrary, modern teaching becomes especially effective when it combines freedom of thought with purposeful organization of collective work. Although the final conceptual slide is presented in a concise visual form, its message is clear. The development of teaching effectiveness depends on the transition from passive forms of instruction to methods that activate thought, dialogue, inquiry, and responsibility. In other words, effectiveness grows where students are intellectually engaged and where method is aligned with the aims of contemporary higher education. Thus, the lecture as a whole leads to a consistent conclusion. Modern teaching methods are effective not because they are fashionable, but because they correspond more adequately to the demands placed upon both teacher and learner in the present educational environment. Thank you for your attention. I hope this lecture has clarified the pedagogical value of modern teaching methods and has shown how active, interactive, project-based, and modeling approaches may strengthen teaching effectiveness in higher education.